Is 150 too many? This is the IssuesWatch podcast. Hi, I'm Don Meyer, Chief Marketing Officer at the New Jersey Society of CPAs, and welcome to the IssuesWatch podcast. For the past 2 decades, prospective CPAs in New Jersey have had to undertake 150 hours of education before becoming licensed. But a declining CPA pipeline has accountants asking, is the 150 now a barrier to becoming a CPA? The additional 30 hours don't have to be specific to accounting or related disciplines, and some believe that the additional year of education and associated costs are discouraging potential accounting students and those who may sit for the CPA exam. Is it time to reimagine how we prepare CPAs for an increasingly evolving profession? We recently asked NJCPA members to weigh in on the 150-hour requirement. Here with me to discuss the reactions is NJCPA CEO and Executive Director, AJ Johnson. Welcome, AJ.
Thanks, glad to be here.
And Vice President of Government Relations, Jeff Kasman. Welcome, Jeff.
Great to be here, Don.
All right, so Jeff, I know you're used to asking the questions, used to being in this seat, so I'm going to start with you so you can get your feet wet. It seems like everybody's got an opinion on the 150, but I think for this podcast it's good to start with a little history. So how did we get to this point with the 150-hour?
Well, you're asking the right guy because I've been here for 32 years, and so I actually lived through some of the history. The concept of requiring 150 hours, the concept itself has actually been around since the 50s. But nothing really happened with it until the early 80s when Florida adopted it as part of their law. So they had the 150-hour requirement, and there may have been 1 or 2 other states that came along and did it. But the whole thing really picked up in the mid to late 90s. Where there was a coordinated push by the AICPA, and then the state societies got on board, to make this a national thing, to make 150 hours the new standard. And I guess we had it by the early 2000s, and I think most states had it by 2015. And the original arguments for why it needed to be done, because even way back then there was some hostility by some members, although not nearly as great a hostility as you might imagine, because I don't think there was any state where there was enough internal opposition within the community that it was stopped. You know, we passed it relatively soon, and then over the next 15, 20 years, it was just a national push to get every state to do it, and finally, I don't know, last state was probably 4 or 5 years ago.
And some of the pushback from some in the profession about trying to change the 150, you mentioned that it started in the mid-90s and really wasn't completed across all 50 states until about 20 years later. So that's a concern, right? That if you try and change it back again, it's going to take another 20 years.
Yes. Right. And I can, when we talk about what's the future of all this, I can get into that. But yes, that's the biggest concern.
Right, but on the flip side, you also have concern I mentioned in the intro about that there is no specificity with the extra 30 credits. Sure. And so there's been articles written. There was an article in Accounting Today a few months ago about different courses that people had taken in order to get to the 150. And one of them, my personal favorite, was Alabama dinosaurs. So
it's a rigorous topic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it was fascinating. Whether or not it helps you as a CPA, though, is a different story. So thanks, Jeff. So AJ, let's take a step back, and before we get into the details of the member survey, please let the audience know what are the fundamental pipeline challenges? What's the profession up against?
So one is that there's lower college enrollments and a pending enrollment cliff, and that's partially due to declines in the overall birth rate, and then there are declines in just enrollment in general. So when you look at, that's top level, right? Mm-hmm. And then when you drill down, we have fewer accounting majors, which will lead to fewer accounting graduates. And there are a whole myriad of reasons why that is the case. And obviously we want more CPAs because that's the gold standard. Right. And so we have fewer people sitting for the exam and actually going on to become licensed.
And the enrollment cliff that you referenced, that's really more about just demographics, right?
Correct.
I mean, just fewer people available to go to college,
Correct.
not so much that they're choosing not to go into accounting.
Correct.
Yeah, and we've already started to see some of that cliff because recently, I think it was NJBiz came out with an article and said that New Jersey community colleges and four-year schools have already seen about a 2% decline. So that enrollment cliff, which we're looking towards, say, 3 years down the road, we're already starting to see some of the
We're
impact
starting
of
to
that.
see it already.
Right,
So
right. All right, so let's dig into that survey I mentioned earlier.
Sure.
We asked our members, we had a tremendous response, over 1,000 members responded. What were some of your key takeaways from the survey?
One would be that more than 40% of the 1,000 plus members felt that new hires working in accounting related roles and without 150 hours, they are less likely to sit for the exam and to pursue CPA certification. So that's something that to me is very striking when you think about those who are already in the profession
Right.
and who we could be reaching to achieve the gold standard of becoming a CPA. So that's number one. The other is that 62% of the respondents see no noticeable difference between those with 120 hours, as Jeff was talking about earlier, and those with 150 credits.
And I thought that was a striking statistic. I mean, you're talking over 1,000 people, 60% of them saying they didn't see any difference
Correct.
between those extra 30 credits. And these are accomplished professionals.
Right.
So that was really a stat that kind of stood out to me.
Same.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that, you know, and to your point, 30 hours, there's no formula around it. There's nothing that says, you know, take specific courses in analytics or things that are really going to help you, you know, perform or better and when you come into the firm and receive, you know, considerations for promotion and all that, and just coming in as new talent, right?
Right.
What do the new professionals entering the profession really need to bring to the table? And so that's part of the problem with the 30 hours is that it's not addressing that specifically.
And one of the interesting things, I've spoken to college classes in the past, juniors, seniors, they know they need 150 credits in order to get licensed, and they're asking me, you know, I mean, and not that I don't have, you know, some knowledge. I have a liberal arts background, so I can certainly speak to that, but I always found it fascinating that these accounting majors who are going into CPAs are like, well, what do you think I should take? You know,
Yeah.
Communications, you know, presentation skills, things like
Right.
that, but I always found that interesting. And so when I started hearing concerns about the 150, I was kind of like, okay, yeah, I can kind of see that. But continue with the results of the survey.
Yes, and nearly 80% of respondents believe it would be beneficial to the profession to provide alternative pathways to certification where 150 is not the only option, so ensuring that we have alternative pathways. And, you know, what's clear is that CPAs want to explore other options because the landscape, our ecosystem, and, you know, we talked about demographics, that's different, right? And we know that CPAs don't want to jeopardize the ability to serve clients and provide services across state lines and maintain what we refer to as that practice mobility for CPAs.
Yeah, I think that came through loud and clear. CPAs want change because they see this dearth of CPAs, dearth of accounting graduates, but it's a tough line to walk, you know, to try and figure out how you make changes without impacting mobility. So Jeff, I'll turn it over to you. Why is providing alternatives to the 150, why is it, while also simultaneously protecting mobility, why is it so tricky?
Well, the accounting profession is more uniform, meaning states are similar to each other than probably any other profession in the country. All the professions are licensed by the states, not the federal government. I guess if there was just one CPA license granted by the United States, or the lawyer, bar, you know, but they're not. They're individual. But accounting, the accounting profession over the years has been able to work real hard. You have the AICPA, American Institute of CPAs, and the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy work together every few years to update what they call the Uniform Accountancy Act, which is something they try and get every state to enact. And most states, including New Jersey, do adopt most of it. Not all of it. There's always little changes. But so built into that, after they passed, most of the states passed 150, two things happened. One, most states passed it. And then while that was happening, most states passed the mobility law, which basically said if your requirements to become a CPA in Delaware, let's say, well, Delaware's a bad example because they're different. New York, if your requirements to become a CPA, education, licensing, exam, is similar to ours, New Jersey, meaning substantially equivalent, well, mobility basically says you can come in here and do some work without having to get a reciprocal license or registering, and and so basically all of the states, we've reached a point where all the states have 150, or almost all of them, and all of the states have mobility. So part of mobility is saying you have to be substantially equivalent. And I think it's NASBA that looks at everything your state has, and is it substantially equivalent to the grand, model. And so once you start changing and a state says, well, you know what, we only require 120 hours now. Let's say that's New York. Well, then they're really not substantially equivalent with New Jersey, and so New Jersey can say, well, then you guys can't come in here and practice mobility. And then New York could say to us, or any other states, well, if you don't recognize us in your state, we're not recognizing you. So that's why it threatens mobility. And it took 20, 30 years to get this uniformity of the 150 hour and then the mobility. And so it's much more complicated than it sounds. It's not just a matter of switching it to 120.
But despite those complications, despite everything you just described, states are still pursuing alternative pathways. So what alternative pathways are being explored here in New Jersey as well as other states?
Well, this whole issue exploded a year or two ago, and I would say, it's sort of, the pipeline has been an issue for a couple of years, or an issue that people are becoming more aware of. And it actually started in New Jersey, as far as at least publicly happening. Our Board of Accountancy, the members have been pretty adamant, that they think the 150 is outdated. Now, they haven't passed any regulations or anything to do anything about it, and partly because they knew that if they did, then there's the whole, maybe New Jersey CPAs couldn't practice in other states, mobility's threatened. And it's a little bit complicated, but almost single-handedly, one of the members, Dan Geltru, who we've had on before, he sort of brainstormed and was meeting with leaders from the AICPA and NASBA and trying to get them to somehow bring it down to 120. And through that process, he and maybe a few others came up with the concept of, okay, if we can't change it, so that only 120 hours are needed, then why don't we give students credits for working? And that's how the whole PwC, St. Peter's program, I think they call it work for credit.
Right,
Basically, the idea is you work that fifth year, or you get your 120, then you work at a job at a firm somewhere and the firm is working with the university, any university, to administer and watch to make sure you're actually doing what you're supposed to do. And then the college says, okay, you get 30 credits for that. And the company says, here, you get paid. And on top of that, you will actually, it turns out, meet your 1 year experience requirement.
Right.
So it's a way to get the 150 without having to go an extra 30 credits of school. Now, you do still have to pay, somebody has to pay the university a reduced price, because they're not teaching the classes. So that kind of, there was no changes needed to the accountancy regulations or statutes. Flew through, everybody loved it, and New Jersey was sort of like on, the front page of the counting.
Right.
And then Minnesota came in, and they introduced legislation. This was led by their CPA society to just get rid of or provide an option to get rid of the 150-hour requirement, and that set off sort of a civil war.
Right. And what Minnesota's legislation does, and if I understand it correctly, it's supposed to be looked at during this legislative session in Minnesota, which, if it's not happening now, I think is coming up. But Minnesota they didn't necessarily want to get rid of the 150. They wanted to provide options, alternatives to getting to that 150.
Right. A doubling, I think, of the experience requirement.
Right.
So as that started sort of a civil war, NASBA and AICPA, especially in the beginning, were adamantly opposed to any changes.
Right.
And they made the argument that we were discussing, that it took us 30 years to get here, and now you're just going to rip it down. It'll take us 30 years to fix it, and it'll take forever. And there was also some of that argument again about how, well, that if it's only 120 hours, we're not really a profession, and I still don't buy that argument. Right. But so there was very vehement sort of struggle there. But then, I always got the sense, like when I met with my counterparts and, conferences and so on, most CPAs just think we don't need that 150-hour thing.
Right.
It's just, so the pressure kept growing. AICPA started a program called ELE, Experience, Learn, and Earn, which sounded like it was the program that Dan Geltrude, PwC, came up with, in which you could you get your 120 credits at a university, then working with the AICPA, they would match you up with a firm and a school. In this case, they've started this program, Tulane University, where you would go to that school online, very inexpensive, and earn your 30 credits, and you'd have a part-time job working for some firm getting paid. The problem is that's not the same as New Jersey's program, because in New Jersey's program, you don't have to take any coursework.
Right.
So nobody really saw that as a solution. But I will say the good news is, from the last that I've heard, there seems to be some agreement or acceptance by NASBA and AICPA that there's got to be another option for the 150. And from what I've heard, the latest that they're coalescing around is a concept where, okay, you get your 120 credits, and then you need to get 2 years of experience, but that experience has to fit some sort of measurable program.
Right. Right.
That would be administered, let's say, I don't know if it would be the AICPA or who would say, well, what you need to have 2 years of experience, you can get paid for it, and we're not necessarily going to call it credits, but you have to learn this, learn that, do this,
Yeah, well, it's all part of a concept that they're looking at now, so I'm sure that more information will come out as to what that really looks like, but I think the point is, at least they're having the conversation,
it's moving forward.
And we're moving forward with the conversation and what that might look like, especially if they make changes to the UAA.
Right. And you mentioned that concept to me a couple of days ago, and what I didn't mention to you is I think that model actually would bring accounting in line with other majors and professions that accounting is competing with. For example, my son studying computer information science. In order to get an internship or a co-op, he can't just go work someplace and call it a computer information science co-op. It has to meet certain criteria, certain standards. He has to actually code. He can't just go there and make copies or get coffee or something. It actually has to meet certain criteria. So that model actually does make, I think, some sense.
And they already do that. For students from other countries who come here and they only have a 120-hour requirement in their country, well, somebody perhaps has a chartered accountant's license from England or wherever, has had their 120 hours, but they've had 8 years of experience. When they come over and try to get reciprocity or get a license in America, generally speaking, they have to prove in some way that their experience is equal to that 30 credits. And so there is a whole system that NASBA already has that checks the experience for all that. So it wouldn't be totally made up out of nowhere. It still, though, could require or would require some statutory, regulatory changes. But it seems to me like people are beginning, the AICPA and NASBA are no longer just headstrong fighting it, but they're looking for, so there might be, some agreements made relatively soon, and then how long would that take to, roll out? It's hard to say.
Right. Well, it seems like we transitioned to arguing about whether or not there should be change to arguing about what the change should be, which I think is progress.
Yes.
I think that's progress.
Yeah.
Before we move on, I did want to mention, you talked about PwC and St. Peter's and the Work for Credit program. I just want to put in a plug for one of our members, Bridget D'Souza, who is a professor at St. Peter's, who has just been incredibly helpful to us, but also mention that in addition to PwC and St. Peter's, this past year, Witham and Seton Hall also entered into a similar agreement. And we do know that other firms and schools are looking into it, but as you mentioned, there are costs involved and other things. So, but hopefully that program will continue to grow as the whole country tries to figure out what we're going to do across the country. So, Jeff, you mentioned AICPA, you mentioned NASBA. It seems like everybody has a task force. So, of course, we do too.
I can't keep track of them.
Yeah, so last year, the Society's Board of Trustees, Strategic Planning Committee, approved the formation of a pipeline task force. The group has been working hard the past 6 months under the direction of a member, Zach Cohen, who did a tremendous job. So members agreed on several fundamental principles and 3 areas of focus. Could you discuss those?
Sure. So just to speak to the fact that everyone has a task force, that's, I think, a plus.
Yes.
Because we want to make sure that there's overall alignment, within the profession and how we get to the next step. So NJCPA, we had a task force, and as you mentioned, Zach led that, and very thankful for the work of the task force. So one, there were 3 key areas of focus. One was around high school and college strategies to reach those negative perceptions and to change negative perceptions that we know students and candidates may have along the journey.
Right.
The other is thinking about the barriers to licensure and addressing those so that we can create more efficiencies and streamline the process, because we know that there are barriers along the way, not just one particular point in time. And then the third was really getting professionals, our firm leaders, those in the profession, to create programs such as Work for Credit, and to really think about recruitment, retention, the firm strategies.
And that last point, just the idea of firm culture, making sure that firm leaders and professional leaders are looking at the research and seeing some of the concerns that accounting students, accounting graduates have about the profession, and maybe adjusting their models accordingly.
Yes, absolutely. I think the conversations are really around firm culture and showing students and new talent, bringing them in and giving them a different experience so that they could stay in the profession. And I know so many of our firm leaders are thinking about that and looking at ways to really improve firm culture. And it's not just salary, but it's, what is your experience day to day, and how can you create a sense of community for those coming in so that they actually stay with the firms and stay in the profession.
Right. And we know change is possible because for the last 2 years, Jeff said this pipeline issue has been discussed for the last couple of years, and salary always comes up.
Right.
But recent studies have indicated that entry-level accounting professionals, when you look at their starting salary versus other professions, accounting's made a lot of really great strides in that salary area. So they have adjusted that key point, but there are some other areas that need to be addressed as well.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, okay, great. So AJ, Jeff, thank you so much. Great discussion. Really appreciate it. We covered a lot of ground, but I just want to ask, do you have any closing thoughts? Jeff, we started with you, so we'll start with you again.
I would just say once again that I think looking at the short and long-term future, I think there's going to be change. First, it'll come, as maybe some sort of agreement between all the groups that, hey, we all agreed on this, and a year ago it didn't look like there'd be any agreement on anything. And then how long it would take to implement, I don't know. Could be years, maybe not, but something's going to happen.
Agreed. AJ, how about you?
Yeah, my thoughts are, it's great to pilot the programs, work for credit. I think it's great that New Jersey is in a space where we can do that. And I'm happy that other universities and firms are thinking about that as well. And I hope that we can get to the point where we can scale a lot of this work so that, the small and mid-sized firms, and we can bring in any employer who, wants to bring in talent within the profession will have an avenue to, bring in more students and early talent and support them through the whole journey. So,
all right, great. I think that's a great place to stop.
Okay.
I think. Yeah. Again, AJ and Jeff, thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching and listening. We'll continue to share information about efforts to address the pipeline challenges here in New Jersey and nationally at njcpa.org/pipeline. And the NJCPA Convention and Expo, taking place June 11th through 14th in Atlantic City, it's not that far off, will feature a panel discussion hosted by AJ about specific initiatives being undertaken and how everyone can play a role. You can register for the convention at njcpa.org/convention.